Well, welcome to the 700 Club. You know, folks, I'm expecting God to do a miracle. I know so many people have been praying about America, praying about the future, and I think God himself is going to get the glory. But boy, he's never late, but he sure takes us close to the wire. And down in Georgia, they're having another one too close to call. The margins are razor thin in the Georgia election. So why is the media already calling one race for the Democrats? And how are the Republicans responding? Eric Phillips has more from Atlanta.
Good morning. I'm here at the Georgia State Capitol where the Secretary of State will ultimately have to certify this election as he does any election. That is still to come. But right now, some media outlets are projecting that Reverend Raphael Warnock has won against incumbent Senator Kelly Loeffler. And right now, the numbers are seeming to sway in favor of Jon Ossoff as well.
I am going to the Senate to work for all of Georgia. No matter who you cast your vote for in this election, in this moment in American history.
But Loeffler's not conceding the race.
We got lots of things to go out, but we got some work to do here. This is a game of inches. We're going to win this election.
In the other race, Democrat challenger Jon Ossoff has the lead. But with votes still to be counted, it's still too close to call. It's why turnout was key. On runoff election day, we saw lines from early in the morning and into the evening. Voters didn't seem to mind because they realized the importance of this historic day. Even voters like 18-year-old Isaiah Salazar, who's participating in his first elections.
It feels great knowing that I have like a voice.
Every election is significant. I mean, I think you need to stay informed no matter what, but this one especially.
Tiffany Rivera says important issues like immigration drove her to the polls.
Just the kids that are suffering and separated from their parents and stuff like this. Being pregnant also, I think about my kids. Being a Latino, I feel like the Latino community needs to get out and vote.
A record-setting 3 million plus voters cast their votes early. Then some precincts saw more turnout Tuesday than for the general election in November. Voters say they understand why.
The country's on the line, our safety's on the line, just having a government that can actually govern is on the line, so.
If you care about your way of life, you're definitely going to do that today.
Yeah, I'm ready to move forward on so many levels.
One-on-one government.
Be known as early as this afternoon, but Georgia law does allow for candidates to request a recount if the margin is within 0.05%. If everything goes the way that it's looking, though, this will be an historic election. Reverend Warnock being the first African-American senator elected for Georgia ever, and Jon Ossoff being the youngest senator elected in some 40 years, Pat.
Eric, when you were talking to people, what seemed to be driving the train? What was causing them to vote? Was it, we have some Hispanics talking about immigration. What was the issue that, in their mind, do you think that was causing their vote?
I think that the major issue, Pat, and let me just preface that by saying there are several of them, immigration being one, the coronavirus being another, law enforcement changes being another. But I think the overall issue, if I were to put it in one broad category, would be change. People are looking for change. Voters I spoke to say they want change. They feel like the last 4 years we've gone down a road that they don't like, many of the voters I speak to, and they're looking for something different. And if this can aid in getting that something different that they're looking for, then they're all for it. And I think that's why we saw such high numbers in terms of early voting, and I think that's why we saw such interest yesterday on Election Day. Bear in mind, Pat, that we're talking about 4.4 million people who voted in this runoff election here in Georgia, and that is more than the number of people in Georgia who voted in the 2016 general election.
Eric, I want to ask you another question. The president dumped pretty heavily on the Republican governor and the Secretary of State of Georgia. Did his comments have any impact in limiting the number of evangelicals or other voters who may have showed up?
I'd have to say the answer to that is yes, and that had been the major fear for those among evangelicals, among conservatives, and those who are in Republican ranks, that the president was really doing more harm than good with his constant drumbeat about alleged fraud, with his constant drumbeat among those who are in Republican leadership here in the state of Georgia, the Secretary of State and the governor, as well as the lieutenant governor. All of those things sort of casting a shadow of doubt over this runoff election and possibly dissuading some voters, some Republican voters, from even going to the polls. I think that you're going to find in the days and weeks to come that many are going to equate a loss here in Georgia, if in fact that's what is certified, a loss for Republicans. They're going to equate that with many of the statements that President Trump himself has made.
Eric, thank you so much for your insights. It's shocking, isn't it?
It's incredible what we're witnessing in our country right now. And although there was, it looks like it's going to go for the Democrats in Georgia. I mean, think about 50%.
We had a TV station in Atlanta, and we had a studio there, and we had prayer counselors, and we had the most wonderful thing. And Georgia was a very conservative state. Exactly. And to see this thing, these are two of the most radical senators you could imagine. I mean, Warnock was guilty of some really horrible things, and the other Senator Ossoff was again somewhat on the fringe, and yet this is Georgia, and I can't believe it, but it's happening. And what we have to ask ourselves is there some kind of a delusion that has come upon the entire electorate in America? Is there something there? Well, it just seems like that era, we want change, but change to what? And what are you going to get? And do we want socialism? Do we want something else? But anyhow, what I have been praying, and many others have, is that something is going to happen that God himself is going to get the glory of, that will bring about a change in the Electoral College. And you know, the Vice President Pence does not control the Electoral College vote. He presides over the counting of the ballots, but he is not in control of it. And from beyond that, the Congress itself is going to have a debate. So in other news, the potential fireworks on Capitol Hill, Republicans are locked and loaded to challenge Joe Biden's victory in the Electoral College. And Vice President Mike Pence is in the hot seat. Charlene Aaron explains.
What is normally a formality in every presidential election is taking on new significance in President Trump's quest to hold on to the White House. The Constitution calls on Congress, overseen by the Vice President, to count and certify the Electoral College votes, officially proclaiming the winner of the election. It's a ceremony that usually takes less than an hour. This year, it could go well into the evening as GOP lawmakers in the House and Senate plan to object to some of the Electoral College votes, triggering hours of debate and votes on each objection.
They go back to the House, they go back to the Senate, and they debate whether or not that objection should be sustained or overruled.
Biden and Kamala Harris won the election with an Electoral College victory of 306 to Trump's 232. All eyes now on Vice President Mike Pence. President Trump claims he has power to reject electors.
I hope Mike Pence comes through for us, I have to tell you.
Tuesday, the New York Times reported that Pence told the president he lacks authority to block the congressional certification. But the president is denying Pence said that. Still, many legal experts agree that Pence doesn't have the authority to overturn the election.
I actually don't think that's what the Constitution has in mind. If that were the case, any vice president could refuse any election.
Not only is the protest dividing the two parties, it's also dividing the GOP. Politico reports that at least 24 Republican senators are on record that they'll vote to certify Biden's win, and another 14 have not taken a public stance. As all this is going on, thousands of Christians will be marching and praying in the nation's capital. Charlene Aaron, CBN News.
Well, CBN Chief Political Analyst David Brody is here to explain all this work. David, you'd like to take us through the process? What's going to happen?
Right. So, Pat, where do we even begin? Well, let's just start, like you said, with the process. Okay. So Mike Pence will be the president of the Senate today, the vice president, but still the president of the Senate. He will count these electoral certificates from each state. He'll start A to Z. It'll start with Alabama, no problem. Then it'll be Alaska, no problem. And then all of a sudden we get to Arizona. And that's where it gets dicey. We understand that Senator Ted Cruz will object at that point. Also, a U.S. congressman will object too. They'll both have to put it in writing. They'll actually approach the House lectern there and put it in writing and give it over to the vice president, the president of the Senate. And at that point, everything comes to a halt. At that point, there's an official objection, and therefore the House and Senate will then go and debate for 2 hours about this objection. The House will have a separate vote after 2 hours. The Senate will have a separate vote about Arizona and that objection after 2 hours. And then they'll come back to the joint session of Congress and continue on with each state. Now, you're going to probably ask me, well, what happens exactly in the House and the Senate? We know how that's going to happen. We know what's going to happen. The House is going to reject the objection because they're controlled by Democrats. The Senate, yes, right now they're controlled by Republicans, but the truth of the matter is they're going to reject the objection because there's no way there's going to be 50 United States senators, Republican senators, that are going to go for this. So you're going to have both chambers of Congress rejecting the objection. And at that point, Mike Pence would have to certify the votes for Arizona. And then they'll go on to other states, and Pennsylvania will be objected to, as well as Georgia too. So those are the three states that there'll definitely be objections, and then there might be others as well. That's how this is going to play out. We can talk about the vice president's role in all of this in a moment, but I wanted to at least give you kind of a layout of how this is all going to happen.
David, have you had a chance to analyze what if they reject Biden-Harris? Somehow the electors, because there's some fraud or there are a number of congressmen, actually each state votes as a body on certain of these matters. It isn't individual senators. It's one state, so they'll vote. Arizona, so many electors. So have you thought what might happen in case they reject Biden-Harris?
Right. So if it ever gets to that, in other words, here's what needs to happen. There are two things that are going on here, Pat. If you have any hope, I just talk about the Trump supporter. If the Trump supporter has any hope at all of the president still staying on, what needs to happen is Joe Biden's at 306 electoral votes. Somehow, some way, what Trump supporters are hoping is that it'll get under the 270 threshold, that Georgia's 16 votes would be thrown out, 11 votes Arizona be thrown out, 20 in Pennsylvania be thrown out. That gets you under the 270 threshold. At that point, you have a contingent election, and then what you're talking about, the state delegations would vote in the House of Representatives. In other words, it would be 50 votes. Each state delegation votes. It's not Nancy Pelosi and the Democrats. And at that point, there are more Republican state delegations than Democrats, and Donald Trump would remain in the White House. However, at this point, it's not getting to any of that. And the reason is that most likely, my sources are telling me that Mike Pence will indeed play the ceremonial role and have to certify these electoral votes for Joe Biden today. Here's the one piece of drama to watch today, the realistic piece of drama. Will Mike Pence boot this back to the state legislature? There's a theory here, and it's more than just a theory. What he could do is, rather than just looking at the envelope and saying, no, I decertify these results, no one's thinking he can do that. Maybe the president thinks he can do that, but no one really thinks he can do that. But what he could do is, as president of the Senate, basically say, state legislatures, we have an issue here. We have electoral votes for Joe Biden, but we also have 7 other states that have sent up dueling electors. Pat, I got to tell you, I have checked on this. There are 7 states that have sent dueling electors to the National Archives. They're ready to go. So what Mike Pence could say is say, look, we've got a contested election here. We have a disputed election, and then ask the state legislatures to figure it out and get back to him. That's what they're hoping. As a matter of fact, we have a tweet from the president just this morning saying exactly that. He says, do it, Mike, do it. Have it go back to the state legislatures, because if that happens, that's the only shot for Trump, that it goes back to the state legislatures. At that point, the legislatures would potentially send the Trump electors, and then it becomes a contingent election.
Boy, It gets curious. Have you researched in history? Something like this has actually happened before in history, hasn't it?
Yeah, well, first of all, let's talk about Thomas Jefferson if we can. Can we go back to 1800 for a moment? The folks that believe that Mike Pence can actually, as president of the Senate, just decertify these results and he's got this power, they're pointing to Jefferson. In 1800, that's exactly what Thomas Jefferson did. Remember, Thomas Jefferson was the vice president of the United States at the time, but he was also president of the Senate. And there were disputed results in Georgia at the time. I know I'm going back to 1800, but there were disputed results in Georgia. And Thomas Jefferson ignored those results and said, you know what? No, we're actually going to accept the Georgia electors. And guess what? It made him president of the United States, by the way. And so that's their precedent on this. They're saying that, look, Thomas Jefferson did this in 1800, and he was in a very interesting role as the vice president and had an actual stake in what would happen if he accepted those Georgia electors. So he had the power to do it in 1800. It's a long story. Then we get into the 1887 Electoral Count Act and all of that, and things changed since then. But the point is that they're going to point to that as to the reason Mike Pence has that power.
Well, David, we'll eagerly be awaiting, but in my feeling, is something dramatic is going to happen that would change this, but this has to be God himself, because I don't think from an electoral standpoint we're going to overturn anything that's been done. Well, but the Lord can do it, but only God. Well, David, thank you.
Pat, what I was...
Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead.
Well, I was going to say one last thing. What we're starting to see now, we already have 100 state legislators that have signed a letter to Mike Pence saying, please don't certify the results today. Send it back to us. We have 100 state legislators on the record in a letter to Pence delivered to him this morning. We'll see what he does.
Well, we'll keep on waiting, but folks, a lot of people have been praying. I've been praying, and Wendy, isn't this amazing?
I'm believing in the God who parts the Red Sea.
Amen.
And he did it right when it was needed.
He's never late. He's never late. All right, keep that in mind. All right.